Yesterday is wrong because yesterday is not today. Among the many things that Christ Jesus taught us, he always taught us that we had to start out with a foundation that was firm. He writes here, rather he spoke here, and it was written of him, that therefore anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came, the streams rose, and the winds beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. That is Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 27. He's calling us here to make sure that our foundation is on something that is external to ourselves. And it might be harder to build a foundation on rock than it is to build a foundation on sand. But the one will last, whereas the other is doomed to failure as soon as it is begun. This leads us to the subjectivity of words, and I would like to use as an example the word progress. Progress is a word that has been changed in its definition, and that without changing its definition at all. Progressive is seen in the popular modern sense as a word that is automatically associated with being good, while discounting that the result of a disease can be as progressive as the result of a dedicated workout regimen. To be progressive means that you are for people automatically. It's just a complete separation from the definition of the word. This is translated into actions, and any action promoting the subjective notion of progress is justified as good. That is to say, the ends justify the means. This, at its shallow root, is lunacy, if you really think about it. To say that yesterday was wrong because today is right is to say that morality has no true basis, and that for a thing to be right or wrong is different than to say that it is of the way of righteousness or of the way of evil. This only leaves the shifting foundation in which tomorrow, progress, no longer a neutral word that can mean either a good thing or a bad thing according to its relative context, can today mean a good thing, and that without question, and tomorrow can mean a bad thing, and that without question, according to its subjective context. But in neither regard can it be relative to context if it is subjective. It is subject to the soup of the day, which tomorrow might be water, and 3 days hence, soup might be a thing that never existed at all. The major issue that arises when neutral words are given subjective meaning is that the meaning of the word is bound to the impression au courant. When this happens, a word of neutral definition becomes surreptitious in its meaning, deceitful without a clearly defined reason as to why, which is to say, of course, the intent. When words of a seemingly innocuous meaning are given usurpative power, the power of the word itself becomes nullified, or rather it becomes bound to the subjective definition. And under this subjective definition, it ceases to have meaning of any kind. Its power is curtailed, and that if the word be used, it is given in the tainted meaning of the scenario. Yesterday becomes wrong if it suits not today, and conversely does yesterday become right because it is not today. It needs only suffice to the subjective order of the day. Whether the right of yesterday or the wrong of yesterday serves best that mean end goal of today. The fallacy of subjection can only be kept in forward motion for so long ere it falls apart, which is the insidious beauty of the fallacy, that if it fails in one regard, it can use its own self to justify both its fall and its call for reinstatement. Well, socialism hasn't ever been tried right, or whatever kind of argument. Enter doublethink. It both is and it is not. But it must be both simultaneously. Essentially, if walking on the sidewalk becomes a crime, then it is known that sidewalks are not for walking and were never for walking. But if the sidewalk itself becomes a crime, then the walking in general becomes a crime. It is intended to be confusing. It is intended not to make sense. That's the whole idea. The issue with this right here is that when we are subject to the idea of a thing, we no longer are allowed the relative context of what a thing actually means. When the ends justify the means, there is no stopping that shifting sand. That thing will always mean what it is most valuable today for that thing to mean. And herein we begin